Hi, I know I'm just a cat, but I believe in kindness. If you click subscribe under this video, you'll make my day.
My sister clinked her glass with a spoon like it was her own damn wedding, standing right in the center of the room with that wide, sugary grin she'd perfected since we were kids. And just as I raised my champagne to thank everyone for coming to celebrate my engagement, she cut in, smiling like a game show hostess, and said, "Chris and Lena are engaged, and I'm pregnant." 7 words that detonated every ounce of peace in my chest and turned what should have been the best night of my life into a silent, slow-burning humiliation I would never forget. It wasn't even just what she said, it was how she said it, with that fake innocence dripping off her voice like honey that's been left in the sun too long, sweet but sticky and suspicious. You could feel the air shift, like the party had just pivoted on its heel, and all eyes, 50 pairs of them, swung away from me and Chris and straight onto her. Standing there in her tight little cocktail dress that suddenly made sense with her flat shoes and the subtle way she'd held her stomach all evening. The room, filled with friends, cousins, coworkers, and people who barely knew either of us, but loved an open bar, collectively gasped, and then, almost like on cue, the questions and congratulations started flooding toward her like she'd just announced a miracle, not hijacked my goddamn moment. Chris looked at me with this slightly panicked expression, like he knew exactly how I'd take it but didn't want to cause a scene, and for a moment, I genuinely believed I could just let it slide. Let her have her moment. Be the bigger person, like our mother always begged me to be, the one who understands Brianna doesn't always think before she acts. But when Brianna giggled, shrugged, and said, "Sorry, not sorry," like she'd just knocked over a drink instead of steamrolling through the most important announcement of my life, something inside me cracked, and I mean not just a little break, but a fracture that split through years of swallowed insults, overshadowed birthdays, and her nonstop need to make every single thing about her. People started migrating toward her, phones already out to snap photos, some even asking when she was due, if it was a boy or a girl, if they were planning a wedding soon, and meanwhile, I stood there like a damn background extra at my own engagement party, holding a champagne glass no one even noticed I hadn't drunk from, watching my ring sparkle in the dim lights that now felt entirely too romantic for a moment that had gone completely off script. My mom wrapped Brianna in a hug so tight it looked like she was about to cry, and my dad raised a toast to both the happy couples, his voice booming, while my name got mentioned like an afterthought. I didn't cry, though I wanted to. I didn't yell, though I felt the heat crawling up my throat like bile. I just smiled, the way I'd been trained to since we were kids, polite, calm, gracious, and I kept that smile plastered on my face as I excused myself to the bathroom where I could breathe. I stared at my own reflection, the woman in the mirror looking polished and put together, but hollow-eyed, like she wasn't quite sure if she was allowed to be angry or if she was just being dramatic again, like Brianna always used to say when I called her out. Chris eventually found me there, leaning against the sink, arms folded, my eyes dry but burning. He stepped in and closed the door quietly behind him, standing next to me without touching me, like he knew I needed space, but also knew silence wouldn't be enough. After a long pause, he said, "You okay?" Which was a dumb question, but somehow the only right one. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "She always does this," I said, voice low, steady, like I was explaining a science fact. "Every single time. She finds a way to make it about her." Chris didn't argue. He just nodded, because he'd seen it too, maybe not all of it, but enough. Then I turned to him and said something I hadn't planned, hadn't even thought about until that very moment, but not this time. "She's not going to win this time." I didn't know what I meant yet. I didn't have a plan. But somewhere deep in the back of my mind, under all the years of being the good sister, the reasonable one, the dependable one, something darker started to stir, something calculating and cold. I didn't want revenge just to be petty. I wanted justice. I wanted her to feel what it was like to be erased from her own story. To be standing in the center of a room and realize no one's looking at you. And that night, as we drove home in silence and the engagement cake we paid $300 for sat untouched on a silver tray next to half-drunk bottles of Prosecco, I started thinking about how easy it would be to return the favor. Because here's the thing no one tells you about revenge. It doesn't start with rage. It starts with heartbreak. And I'd just been handed the perfect reason to stop being nice. Now the only question was, how far was I willing to go? There's a special kind of exhaustion that comes from years of biting your tongue, and I don't mean the everyday kind of stress or the fleeting annoyance of someone cutting in line. I'm talking about the deep, marrow-level fatigue of constantly making yourself smaller so someone else can feel bigger, of stepping back again and again, so the person you're supposed to love most can shine without ever wondering who she's stepping on to do it. That's what it was like growing up with Brianna, not just once in a while, not just here and there, but always, relentlessly, like some unwritten rule had been stamped onto our family dynamic. Lena will handle it. Lena will be fine. Lena will understand. And Brianna, well, Brianna's just Brianna. It started small, as these things often do. At my 10th birthday party, the one I'd been counting down to for months, complete with a handmade cake shaped like a horse, and those cheap plastic goodie bags filled with candy and stickers, Brianna, only 6 at the time, threw a tantrum about not getting her own cake. And instead of being gently told that not everything was about her, our mother quietly sliced her the biggest piece and sang an extra round of happy birthday just for her. I remember sitting there with my paper crown slightly crooked, the icing on my piece melting, as everyone clapped and laughed and joked about what a handful she was, and something inside me, something small but significant, folded itself up and stayed quiet. As we got older, the pattern sharpened. When I made valedictorian in high school, Brianna came to the ceremony wearing a sequined mini dress and sobbed loudly through my speech because her boyfriend had broken up with her the night before. The pictures from that day don't even show me with the medal. I'm off to the side, smiling awkwardly, while everyone is huddled around her, comforting, consoling, telling her how strong she is. At college, when I got my first internship, she got caught shoplifting lip gloss from the campus CVS, and I spent 2 days on the phone trying to help her out of it because our parents were too stressed to deal with another one of her slip-ups. Every single time something good happened to me, it seemed like fate or Brianna found a way to spin the spotlight right back onto her. So when she hijacked my engagement party, it wasn't even a surprise so much as the final confirmation of a truth I had long suspected, but had never dared speak aloud. She didn't care about me. Not really. Not in any way that mattered. She cared about attention, and if mine got in the way of hers, she would bulldoze it without a second thought, dress it up in faux sweetness, and then act confused when anyone pushed back. That little sorry not sorry laugh she gave at the party, it wasn't just careless, it was deliberate, a flick of the wrist dismissal from someone who's never had to deal with consequences. But the thing that gutted me most, the thing that made my chest tighten even 3 days later as I sat at my kitchen table with the engagement cards half written and the cake topper still in a box by the sink, was not her announcement. It was the way our family responded. My mom called the next morning, all bubbly and breathless, rambling on about baby names and nursery colors, barely pausing to ask if I was okay. My dad left me a voicemail that said, well, big weekend for the family, as if we hadn't just been steamrolled by Brianna's need to be the center of gravity. Not a single person, not one, reached out to ask how I felt about any of it. It was like I had disappeared in plain sight, erased by a sonogram that hadn't even been seen yet. Chris, bless his level-headed soul, tried to play the diplomat, suggesting we let it go, that maybe she just didn't realize the impact it had. But I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe it. He was trying to keep the peace, to keep things simple, and part of me loved him for that. But a bigger part of me, the part that had been pushed aside for decades, wasn't interested in peace anymore. I wanted war. Not loud, screaming, dramatic war. Something quieter, colder, smarter. I didn't want to yell or cry or explain myself again and again just to be ignored. No. I wanted a moment where the silence would say everything. That's when I remembered Brianna's wedding date, or rather, the date she'd circled on the family group chat 2 months earlier with 1,000 heart emojis and an enthusiastic, save this date, tagged to it. It was still 6 months away. Still up for grabs. Chris and I hadn't chosen a wedding date yet. We'd been casually looking, not rushing anything, because we wanted it to feel right. But now, I had a reason to lock something in. And maybe, just maybe, the best way to reclaim my voice wasn't to demand attention, but to take it. That night, I reopened our venue research spreadsheet, the one we'd been sharing on and off for weeks, and I started making calls. I wasn't just looking for a location anymore. I was looking for hers. And when I finally reached out to that cozy vineyard she'd been raving about, the one just outside the city where she wanted an autumn fairy tale, and found out it was, in fact, still available on that exact date, I didn't hesitate. I didn't ask Chris. I just said yes. We'd figure out the rest later. Because this time, I wasn't going to step aside. This time, I wasn't going to play nice. This time, she would know what it felt like to plan your future, imagine your perfect day, and then watch someone else take it from you without blinking. And the best part? She wouldn't see it coming. There's something strangely empowering about secrecy, not the messy, guilt-ridden kind that festers under the skin, but the type born from a calculated, razor-sharp clarity. A secret held not out of fear, but as a weapon carefully forged and hidden until the exact moment it's needed. That's what this new plan felt like, and for the first time in years, I wasn't moving around my sister's orbit, adjusting my steps so she could take center stage. I was laying tracks in the opposite direction, and I didn't care who called it petty or vindictive. Because the truth was far simpler. I was done being kind to someone who mistook my silence for submission. The vineyard was perfect, intimate, soaked in autumn light during the early evenings, with a long oak pathway that would turn gold and crimson in October, and an old converted barn strung with warm lights that practically whispered storybook wedding. It had everything Brianna wanted, and more importantly, it had everything I wanted, too. I didn't steal it because I couldn't have found something else. I stole it because she needed to understand what it felt like to lose something she assumed she owned. I signed the contract without fanfare, without a hint of second-guessing, and when Chris came home that night and found me grinning over the final booking email, he didn't even flinch. He just raised an eyebrow, poured us both a drink, and said, "So, we're really doing this?" And I, without missing a beat, said, "We're doing it." Chris never had the same war history with Brianna that I did. He'd always been patient with her, always gave her the benefit of the doubt, but I think something snapped in him that night at the engagement party too, something quieter, maybe, but just as decisive. He didn't argue, didn't ask what would happen when she found out, didn't suggest that we tell the family to avoid a storm. He just nodded and said, "Let's make it beautiful." And for once, I wasn't planning for her reaction. I was planning for mine. The weeks that followed were like walking a tightrope over an open flame. Every detail we arranged felt like a small act of rebellion wrapped in lace and flower arrangements. Every decision I made for our wedding, knowing full well it would overlap with hers, felt like I was reclaiming territory I'd been told wasn't mine to occupy. We picked colors, deep burgundy, cream, and forest green. We selected food, grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, handmade ravioli. We tasted cakes, booked a string quartet, wrote our vows in quiet morning hours, and never once mentioned the date to anyone outside of the vendor emails and our own private calendar. Not even my mother, who would have undoubtedly turned it into another plea for family unity. Not even my friends, who might have tried to talk me down. I wanted no input. No interference. No chance of the secret slipping early. I wanted to watch her discover it the same way I had watched her hijack my night, effortlessly, smiling and with no apology. Meanwhile, Brianna's texts kept coming, as bright and oblivious as ever, her usual stream of consciousness style now amplified by hormones and pregnancy apps. She sent me photos of tiny shoes she hadn't bought yet, links to stroller comparisons, a screenshot of a baby name quiz with a caption that said, "Help. Girl or boy vibes?" I answered sparingly, not because I didn't care, but because I could no longer fake the warmth she expected. I was done being the sister she leaned on while pretending I was a supporting character in a movie that had always been hers. The more she talked, the more I realized she had no idea what was coming, and the more I understood how many times I'd let things slide, let her win, let her narrate both of our lives like she was the only one who mattered. Then, just when I thought I was managing to keep everything perfectly under wraps, a complication arrived in the most unexpected form. Mark, Brianna's fiancé, showed up at my office. No warning. Just an email from reception saying he was waiting in the lobby, holding a coffee and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. I met him downstairs, eyebrows raised, unsure if this was some kind of ambush. But he wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. "I know about the date," he said, not even bothering with a hello, and I felt my stomach twist, not from guilt, but from the sudden realization that the house of cards might be wobbling earlier than I'd planned. I kept my face neutral, sipping my own coffee and gesturing for him to keep talking. "She doesn't know." "Not yet. But I saw your name in the venue's email chain." She left it open on the laptop. For a second, I imagined the explosion, the glass-shattering shriek that would undoubtedly echo through her condo when she put the pieces together. But then he added, quietly, almost apologetically, "Don't change it." His voice cracked just slightly at the end, and I stared at him, trying to decipher his tone. He looked tired. Not just physically, but the kind of tired that comes from years of being overlooked and overruled. "She needs to know what it feels like," he said, and that was the moment I realized he wasn't just warning me, he was giving me permission. He wasn't happy, and I'm sure he felt conflicted, but part of him understood exactly what I was doing, maybe better than anyone else in our orbit ever could. Maybe he'd been living his own version of it all this time. So I nodded, said nothing, and walked back upstairs, leaving him with whatever guilt or relief he needed to process on his own. That night, Chris and I finalized our invitation list. We picked a soft linen paper and a minimalist design. At the bottom, below the RSVP instructions and the dress code, we printed the date, Brianna's date. No fanfare. No explanations. And just like that, the switch was official. Now all that was left was to wait. There's a silence that falls before a storm, not the peaceful kind that feels like a pause or a breath, but the heavy, humming quiet that presses against your skin and makes your heart race without a sound. Like the atmosphere itself is warning you that something irreversible is about to happen. That was the kind of silence that filled the air the day Brianna found out. It didn't come suddenly, with screaming or confrontation or chaos, but crept in slowly, almost elegantly, like tension settling into a house that already knows how this ends. I remember it so vividly because everything else that followed was noise, shattering, relentless, and entirely expected. It started with a phone call, not from Brianna, but from my mother, who never seemed to know how to exist outside of urgency. Her voice was high-pitched, breathless, jumping between sentences without finishing any, as if she were running down a flight of stairs while trying to carry glass. "Lena," she said, her tone already accusatory, "why is Brianna crying in the bathroom? Why is she screaming about dates and weddings and you?" And before I could respond, before I could even ask what exactly had been said or how the pieces had come together, she added, "Did you really schedule your wedding for her date?" I said yes. Not softly, not with shame, but clearly and without hesitation. I said yes with the kind of clarity you only get after years of being asked to explain yourself, only to be told you were wrong for feeling what you felt. The silence on the other end of the line lasted just long enough for me to imagine my mother blinking in disbelief, hand probably clutching her chest like she always did when her daughters did something she didn't approve of. Then, without saying goodbye, she hung up. 20 minutes later, Brianna was at my door. I knew she'd come. I had been expecting her since the moment I made the booking. Still, seeing her there, face streaked with tears, her jaw trembling not with sadness, but with outrage, was more surreal than I had prepared for. She pushed past me without waiting for permission, walking straight into my living room like she owned it, like this wasn't the same girl who had casually destroyed my engagement night with a smirk and a fake apology. "How could you?" she said, and I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the audacity of that question from her, of all people, was so rich with irony it practically echoed. "How could I?" I repeated slowly, like I was tasting the words. "You mean, how could I do to you what you did to me?" She didn't answer. Instead, she paced, arms folded across her chest like she was holding herself together, But her eyes, those same eyes that had once talked me into covering for her a dozen times over, were wild, searching for some crack in my expression where she could insert blame and make me wear it. "You booked my venue," she snapped on my date, behind my back. "Do you know how that makes me look?" And there it was, the root of it all. Not the betrayal, not the relationship between us, but the appearance of things. Her image. Her spotlight. Her narrative. That's what she couldn't stand. That, for once, the story wouldn't be hers to tell. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just looked her in the eye and told her the truth. For 30 years, I've made space for you. I've shrunk myself down, quieted my own happiness, sidestepped my own milestones just so you could feel bigger. And you always took it. Every time. Without asking, without noticing, without caring. This time, I didn't move out of your way. And it's about damn time. She tried to argue. She flailed, tossing out words like family, respect, and forgiveness, as if any of them had weight coming from her mouth in that moment. But the one that stopped me cold was jealous. She looked at me, honestly, truly looked at me, and said, "You've always been jealous of me." I think I laughed again, but this time it hurt. Because the truth is, there was a time long ago when I wished I could be the one people rallied around, the one forgiven before she even asked, the one who could break things and still be loved like she'd built something. But not anymore. Now, I didn't envy her, I pitied her. Because what she didn't realize was that the world she built around herself was fragile, sustained only by other people's willingness to play along. And I had finally stopped playing. Chris came home in the middle of it, walking into the middle of the storm without flinching. He didn't speak right away, just looked between us, waiting to see if either of us would blink. Brianna turned on him, accusing him of conspiring, of enabling me, and he, in that maddeningly calm way of his, simply said, "You knew what you were doing at the engagement party. You just didn't think she'd ever push back." That shut her up. For a few seconds, she looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, less polished, less confident, less certain. But it didn't last. She gathered herself, wiped her face, and before walking out the door, she turned and said something I'll never forget. "You just made a mistake you can't undo." After she left, I found an envelope on the floor, one I hadn't noticed before, tucked inside her purse, probably dropped in the chaos. My name was scrawled on it in her handwriting, and for a moment, I hesitated. I didn't want more drama, didn't want another twisted guilt trip, but curiosity pulled harder. Inside was a letter, one she'd written before she found out, dated a week earlier. In it, she talked about wanting to be close again, about how having a baby had made her think about family, how she realized, maybe for the first time, that she'd taken things for granted. She didn't apologize directly, but the implication was there, buried between the lines, regret, or something like it. It didn't change anything. Not really. But it left a splinter in my chest that I couldn't quite shake. Because revenge, no matter how deserved, is never clean. It cuts both ways. And as much as I wanted her to feel what I had felt, erased, humiliated, sidelined, there was a part of me, small and stubborn, that still wished she'd simply said, "I'm sorry," without a smirk, without a performance, without needing to be cornered. But she didn't. And now the storm had only just begun. Weddings are strange things, not just for their obvious spectacle, the dresses and flowers and carefully scripted vows, but for the way they pull people into a suspended version of reality, where emotions are amplified and everything feels more profound, more final, more symbolic than it really is. I used to think the ceremony was the pinnacle, the peak of emotional intensity, the moment that defined a new chapter, but what I learned on my wedding day, the one I took from my sister with precise, merciless elegance, was that the ceremony isn't the climax, it's the reveal. It's the mirror held up to all the choices you made leading to that moment, and whether or not the reflection staring back feels like justice or regret. The morning of the wedding was unseasonably warm for October, the kind of heat that clings to your skin like a warning, too gentle to call discomfort, but heavy enough to make you sweat in places you'd rather not. Chris was already dressed when I emerged from the bridal suite, his tie askew and his hands fidgeting with the boutonniere he kept insisting was crooked even though it wasn't. There was a strange quiet between us, not cold, not distant, but weighty, like we both knew we were standing on the edge of something that wouldn't end with confetti and champagne. We didn't speak about Brianna. We hadn't spoken about her in days, not since the explosion in our living room and the letter I found folded neatly like some ironic peace offering that arrived 5 minutes too late. We both knew she wouldn't come. But her absence was a presence in itself. Guests arrived in slow waves, many of them confused, some of them clearly uncomfortable, especially the ones who had also received Brianna's save-the-date card months earlier and were now standing in the same venue on the same date, realizing that something deeply awkward and possibly scandalous had happened without any explanation. My mother arrived in a beige suit 2 shades too bland for someone who usually overdressed for breakfast, her face frozen in an expression that might have been passive-aggressive support or pure resentment. I couldn't tell anymore. My father lingered behind her, hands in his pockets, eyes darting toward the parking lot every time a car pulled in, like he was still holding out hope that Brianna might appear at the last second and deliver one of her dramatic, sweeping apologies that would instantly absolve her of everything, just like always. But the space next to his seat remained empty. The ceremony went on as planned, simple, short, beautiful in the way I always wanted, with no speeches, no readings, no symbolic sand ceremonies or doves. Just vows, clear and quiet, spoken like promises that didn't need to echo, only to be understood. I looked Chris in the eye and told him I would choose him every day, not because it was easy or perfect, but because he was the only person who ever made me feel like I didn't need to disappear to be loved. He said something equally honest, though less poetic, and the way he stumbled over the word forever made me laugh just enough to forget, for a moment, that this wasn't supposed to be our day. During the reception, the tension began to melt under the influence of music and wine. People started dancing. Plates were cleared. The awkward glances faded into the background. And then, as the sun dipped behind the vineyard hills, I took the mic for a toast, not because I had planned a speech, but because something in me needed to speak, to put words to the ache in my chest that hadn't gone away, even now. I want to thank all of you for being here, I began, my voice steady despite the weight I felt pressing against my ribs, on a day that was never meant to look like this. A few heads turned. A few people straightened in their chairs. This wasn't supposed to be our date. It wasn't supposed to be this venue. This wasn't supposed to be revenge. I paused, letting that last word hang in the air long enough for people to question whether they had misheard me. I did something I'm not proud of, I continued, eyes scanning the room, and I did it knowing exactly what it would mean. I chose this day, this place, knowing it would hurt someone I love. Because for years, I swallowed my anger, my hurt, my smallness, and when the moment came, I thought taking something back would fix it. I didn't say Brianna's name. I didn't need to. And maybe it did, for a little while. Maybe I needed to feel like I mattered more than just the person who makes room for everyone else. But standing here now, I don't feel victorious. I don't feel proud. I feel heavy. The room was silent. I love my husband, I said, turning to Chris, whose expression held no judgment, only an endless kind of patience I didn't think I deserved. And I love what this day means to us. But I also know that revenge, no matter how elegant, never leaves you clean. It doesn't heal the wound. It just hands it to someone else. I stepped down without waiting for applause. None came. Not out of malice, I think, but because they didn't know what to do with the honesty I had just dropped like a stone into their carefully managed emotions. Later that night, after the music faded and the last guests drifted out, I found an envelope slipped under the door of the bridal suite. My name was written on it again, same handwriting, same shape as the letter I hadn't stopped thinking about. I opened it slowly, half expecting another emotional landmine. But inside, there was no letter this time, just a photo. It was an old picture of Brianna and me, maybe from high school, maybe earlier, standing side by side at the edge of some lake I barely remembered visiting. We were laughing, arms slung around each other, and on the back, in her handwriting, it said, "Before we forgot we were sisters." I sat down on the bed, dress still on, makeup smudged, and stared at the photo until my eyes burned. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because I wasn't sure if I was mourning what we had lost, or admitting that maybe we had never had it to begin with. The next morning, I woke up beside my husband, a ring on my finger and a strange emptiness in my chest. We had done it. We were married. The plan had worked. And yet, all I could think about was a question that kept circling in my mind, quiet but insistent. If justice comes at the price of connection, is it still worth it? I didn't have an answer. Maybe I never will.